Hi, welcome to the video instruction on issuance, trading, and funding of debt securities and fixed incomes. It says basic concepts, and for once that's true. This is a fairly painless reading that we need to go through here. I think we've got 8 LOSs, learning outcome statements here, but a lot of it's definitions and things. So a little lighter than some of the material, but that's good news for you and good news for me too. So I'll try not to just be a slide reader here, although a lot of this is just definitions and things, trying to add a little context and color to help you remember things. But if you're looking at this and going, hey, I already read that, well, there's some value in repetition for the exam too. So if you get a few things out of this and sticks in your memory longer, or maybe a little clarity on the differences between some of this stuff, that would be just great too. So let's jump into our first learning outcome statement and talk about fixed income classifications. You know, we can slice these and dice these anyway, and they're just covering here in the curriculum some of the ways that we speak about bonds and bond markets, and there's certainly a lot of overlap in this. Let's look at the first two, and I'll clear that up. If we talk about the type of issuer, well, we talk about the corporate bond market. These are bonds issued by corporations, right? We're going to differentiate that from the sovereign bond market or government bond market, or the market for asset-backed securities, that the issuer is a special purpose entity or a special purpose vehicle, SPV. And so we can do it this way, but now the next one says, well, we could slice it by credit quality. We could talk about investment grade bonds versus high yield or speculative or junk bonds in terms of credit quality. Well, this goes across the range of corporates right now because the corporates come in all sorts of credit quality. So that's what I mean by the overlap. Just because we're talking about one set of classifications doesn't mean they line up with all the other classifications in some sort of wonderful matrix. So we can talk about credit quality and say, well, we're talking about the investment grade. And remember, investment grade is triple B or better using the Standard & Poor's rating system. Anything lower than that, well, when I was a broker, if we called the clients, it was a high yield bond, and if we were referring to them more casually around the office, they were junk bonds. Maturities, we can talk about the money market, that's securities that mature in a year or less, or capital markets, securities that mature in more than a year. So again, a whole different classification system. Another way is to talk about their coupon structure. We can say, well, we're looking at fixed rate bond markets, or we're looking at the floaters. We're looking at the floating rate bond market. So I think we've got some more classifications here on the next slide. We've got geographic market. We could talk about a national bond market. We could talk about U.S. bonds. We could talk about Brazilian bonds. Or more generally, broader classifications, we could talk about the developed country bond markets or the emerging markets bonds. So we can look at it that way. Clearly, we can talk about currency denomination. Now, bond issuance in terms of total volume primarily or very heavily weighted toward U.S. dollar bonds and euro-denominated bonds. We could talk about we could talk about yen bonds and things like this. So that's a pretty clear classification. We can talk about indexed bonds. Remember, indexed bonds can be linked to, well, any published index or economic number even, like inflation. Index bonds, at least in the U.S., are based on the U.S. Consumer Price Index, our proxy for overall inflation of goods and services prices. There are bonds that are linked to equities, equity indexes. There's bonds that are linked to commodity prices. So we can talk about indexed bonds and then talk about those three categories within this overall category of indexed bonds. In terms of the taxable status, we've got tax-exempt bonds, at least in the U.S., are municipal bonds where the interest is exempt from federal income tax. OID bonds are original issue discount bonds. Excuse me. So issued, it may trade at a little discount or a little premium to its par value. But original issue discount bonds are issued at a rate that is significantly different from the current rate, and so they're sold at a discount. Now, an extreme example of that would be a zero coupon bond or pure discount bond where there's no periodic interest payments. It's just you buy them at 573 and they mature some years later at their par value of 1,000. So that's an OID bond. And the reason that they're listed here in taxable status is because bonds that are issued at a significant discount to their par value, that movement of the discount price up to the par value over the bond's life is really interest income. And so that movement toward par may be taxable, as well as any coupon payments that the bonds make. There are bonds where interest is paid net of tax. It depends on the country of origin and the tax treatment there. So those are both important sources to the bank, but maybe not huge sources, although customer deposits tend to add up. Negotiable CDs are issued in very large denominations, and they can trade on the secondary market. So they trade like a bond with the creditworthiness of the bank standing behind them. Now this becomes, for large banks, this is a very significant source of funds. Then there is the central bank funds market. That's where the central bank loans reserves to member banks. So the central bank in the U.S. lends at this discount rate to member banks. So if they need reserves, they want to expand their loan volume, but they need more reserves to support that, they can borrow those from the central bank, and that's the central bank funds market. Well, sometimes banks don't really want to go to the central bank funds market or the so-called discount window to borrow funds because it kind of reveals information that they're a little short and all this. They can also use interbank funds, and that's where those loans that we used to establish those LIBOR rates, the London Interbank Offered Rate, well, that's what that's all about. One bank has excess reserves beyond what they need to support their current loan portfolio. Another one's a little short. They lend to each other to make sure they meet their reserve requirements by lending these interbank funds. And we talked about that market being from overnight to up to a year, but primarily on the shorter end of the maturity spectrum. Okay, last thing we need to talk about for this reading here is repurchase agreements. This is a funding source for bond dealers, primarily for bond dealers. And here's the idea, okay? If I've got a bond portfolio, I could go borrow from my broker, but I would be subject to these rules and regulations and margin requirements. With a repurchase agreement, I'm going into a less regulated market, and I'm going to sell this bond to the counterparty and agree to repurchase it on the repo date, the repurchase date, at a slightly higher price. The difference between those prices is essentially the interest. The lender is the buyer of the bond, sells it back at a slightly higher price. The difference is the interest earned on the use of that money over the period. So I enter into agreement that says, well, I'm going to sell you this bond for $9.923 million, and I'm going to buy it back 80 days later for, I forget the numbers I used, so say $9.146 million 30 days later, or whatever the term of the repo is. When it's very short, when it's just for one day, that's an overnight repo. And there's quite a bit of businesses done in the overnight market because banks want to true up their reserves, what they have, to where it should be each night. If these repurchase agreements are for periods of greater than a day, then we call it a term repo, and the number of days is the term of the repo. So we've got the repo date, we've got a term. I don't really want it so much, so I'm going to offer you less margin. Yep, that's true. Now, think about the other side of it. when a security is in high demand. That is, somebody wants to own it for whatever reason. So if they want to own that security, they're going to offer a greater repo rate on it, the difference between the buy it and the sell it back price. The repo margin is lower when delivery is required. Well, that's because that's better collateral. Now, you can do these repos a couple ways. You can say, well, okay, you've bought this security. I'm going to make a note, okay, that you're the owner of this security, but not really transfer ownership. Well, if that firm gets into financial distress or bankruptcy during the term of the repo, then what happens? Well, here's a firm that's headed into bankruptcy that's promised to buy this back. But title hasn't really changed you. You don't really have possession of the bond, so it becomes part of the bankruptcy. You got to get in there with the bankruptcy court. You got to negotiate creditors' committees, all this sort of stuff. Now, when delivery is required, so that the lender actually owns the bond, they're in a much better position if the company gets into financial distress. Because then you go, well, I have this bond, and I've agreed to sell it back to you at this price. If you don't pay me the price, I'm not selling it back. I own the bond, not the credit quality of the dealer entering into the repo agreement. So the bond's credit quality may be fine. The party that entered into the repo agreement as the borrower of money and seller of the debt security, they may have the financial distress. But come to a bankruptcy, if I actually have the bond, it's like, well, buy it back from me or don't. See if I care. And that's the way they're structured. So when the delivery is required, that's better collateral. It puts you in better shape if there's a financial disturbance, distress, crisis of some sort at the with your counterparty. The repo rate is lower when the counterparty credit is better. Not the bond credit, but the credit of the borrower who's delivering the security. When their credit's better, the repo rate is lower. And that wraps it up. So that brings us to the end of this session on trading and funding of these securities and banks and interbanks. So I hope this helps you remember some of that. Study hard, and I'll see you next time.